I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. The Petitos have revealed in a recent complaint that Brian Laundrie, using his parents' money, lawyered up on August 29, 2021. This was 2 days after Gabby was last seen, and Brian was still on the road in Gabby's white Ford Transit van, making his way back to Florida from Wyoming. In a frantic call to his folks, Brian told his parents that Gabby was gone and he needed a lawyer. Remember, Gabby was only reported missing on September 11th. So, something like almost 2 weeks later. Brian's parents informed their own lawyer, Steve Bertolino, of the situation on September 2nd. That same day, Bertolino secured the services of the high-powered Fleener Peterson LLC, a Wyoming law firm, on Brian's behalf. That law firm is situated just 6 hours from where Gabby's body was ultimately found. According to The Sun, quote, Bertolino received a $25,000 retainer from the Laundries, which was used to pay Fleener Peterson, according to the court documents. Bertolino also contacted other Wyoming firms, including a public defender in Teton County, the area where Gabby's remains were recovered, on September 19, 2021. Remember, the Petitos have launched a civil lawsuit against the Laundries, which is still pending. In September of this year, the Laundries offered to settle, but the Petitos refused. According to The Sun, quote, the Petitos claim that the Laundrie family gave them false hope that Gabby would be found alive in an attempt to protect their son Brian. The case centers on a statement the Laundries made through their attorney on September 14, 2021, saying that they were hopeful Gabby would be found and reunited with her family, end quote. Now, I do think it is a valid point to say, why on earth would you set aside $25,000, in terms of getting legal representation, if you didn't think there was some serious legal issue that was at work? In other words, that your son might be accused quite soon of a serious crime against Gabby. And this brings us to an aspect that you don't often hear about in true crime, or not often enough: mens rea. Do you know what it means? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Now, in a murder trial, and certainly in other trials as well, but for the purposes of this argument, in a murder trial, there are two components, two legal hurdles, if you will. And the prosecution are burdened with this. In order to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, they've got to prove these two aspects. Firstly, they have to prove actus rea, which is that some kind of physical action took place. In this particular instance, it would involve all the elements of the crime itself, including the autopsy results, the ballistics, a murder weapon, DNA, and other crime scene evidence. Secondly, you have to prove mens rea, which is the mental state or state of mind surrounding the commission of a crime. And often you see investigators, detectives, people that are preoccupied with true crime that are very, they seem to gravitate to the mens rea, the intentions, the psychology leading up to a crime. And often we hear about premeditation. You very seldom hear about the mens rea subsequent to the crime, and even to some extent during the crime itself. Now, I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist to imagine if someone calls you from the road, tells you that their partner is gone and that they need a lawyer. I mean, what are you going to assume just from that small little box of information? Aren't you going to assume guilty knowledge? Aren't you going to assume that something went wrong and someone could be in trouble for doing something wrong? When that person then shows up and it turns out their partner is gone, even more so, right? Now, I don't want to play devil's advocate here. God knows I'm on the Petito side, and I'm very sympathetic to what happened to Gabby. So much so I actually visited Sped Creek Camp in Wyoming earlier this year, and many other spots that featured on Gabby's Instagram. It was a kind of a pilgrimage, and I do think we need to think critically about this aspect if we're going to get a solid handle on how the Petitos can handle their civil suit from a legal merits perspective. If mens rea is about getting into the mind of a murderer, then we have a situation where, I think we also need to get into the mind of the parents of the murderer, right? And I think if you go back to what we know, do you remember that Brian probably staged texts on Gabby's phone saying, for example, no service in Yosemite, implying that she was in Yosemite when she wasn't, implying that she had gone to Yosemite when she hadn't, right? Implying that she had made the decision to go somewhere when, again, she hadn't. Now, he may have told his parents a story that was partially true. He may have told them that the Moab stop happened, and he may have said that what had happened there was that Gabby assaulted him, and then a few weeks later, Gabby left him of her own accord, and then maybe something happened to her. And what would then be the natural thing? Well, people would think that he had something to do with her disappearance, right? That's kind of being quite economical with the truth. But of course, even the police would agree at a certain point, that Gabby had done something to Brian. And so Brian could sort of rely to some extent on that quote-unquote defense. Does that make sense? And so his story would actually correspond in part to the Moab cop's own assessment of the situation. Because, of course, the Moab stop isn't absolutely clear and simple. It's a lot more clear and simple today, especially given the end result. Of course, the second part of his story that he probably told his parents without Gabby or any cops to counter it would be essentially Brian controlling the narrative. He could suggest that Gabby was, in a way, the active person here. She wasn't very happy with him, and she just left him. It doesn't quite make sense why he ends up with a van. I think that's also got to be explained. I suppose he could also say that she went off and something happened. Maybe the same story he said in his suicide note is what he told his parents, that they were heading back to the vehicle in the dark at the camp, and Gabby then fell into the water, and then Brian found her breathing heavily, gasping his name. This is from the note that he wrote. She was already freezing cold, and he carried her as far as he could down the stream towards the car, and then his knees gave in, and he felt he couldn't safely carry her. He starts a fire, and he tries to bring her back to life, but in the end, the elements take over. And he may have said that that's where she died, or that she died may have died in a similar way in Yosemite of the elements. And weren't they going to then pin her death on him? Brian, in his own story, in the note about what happened to Gabby, is that she had a bump on her head. She couldn't tell him what was wrong with her. But essentially that Gabby was responsible for her own death, that she'd fallen in the water, she'd gotten hypothermic, and she couldn't recover. In his note he writes, laying next to her, she said little, lapsing between violent shakes, gasping in pain, begging for an end to her pain. Now, I think that almost implies that she's saying, I don't want to live, not try and help me or try and save me or take me to a hospital or take me to a doctor. Just put me out of this misery, which is ultimately what Brian himself does to himself, He goes on to say, she wouldn't let me cross the creek. She thought like me that the fire would go out in her sleep and she'd freeze. I don't know the extent of Gabby's injuries, only that she was in extreme pain. I ended her life. I thought it was merciful. That it is what she wanted. But I see now all the mistakes I made. Now, I don't know whether this is the story he actually told his parents. I suspect that he may have told an aspect of it, that, that Gabby, to some extent, in terms of his story, wanders into the wilderness, perhaps in the dark, and maybe something happened to her, and he's now going to be accused for that. I kind of get the feeling he's embellished that story in this note. Is in a way telling the same story he told his parents, is expanding on that in this note. And I think you've got to think about this note as primarily directed to his own parents. So the note itself is about controlling the narrative. The question is whether Brian's parents knew or ought to have known what had really happened to Gabby. And I think the part that's missing here is the fact that the Laundries were Brian's parents and would naturally give him the benefit of the doubt. Is it a crime to not have done so? Now, if you doubt that, if you doubt this natural giving the benefit of the doubt, or if you think it's criminal not to do so, or criminal to do so, let me say that I once sat in the trial of triple axe murderer Henry van Breda. I've written a couple of books on that case as well. He was accused of murdering his parents and brother with an axe. I happened to be sitting next to his two uncles in the public gallery in court, and I was quite frankly appalled that they had actually paid, that the family were actually paying for top defense lawyers to defend the son, to defend the murderer, effectively, of their own brother, their own sister-in-law and nephew. And the reasoning was, well, if he's innocent, then the best lawyers will get him off. Of course, and this is what I thought, the converse was also possible, that he might be guilty and good lawyering might get him off as well. And was that really something that the victims deserved? Was that right? And, essentially the victims, in a sense, paying out of their own pockets, essentially, for the defense of the perpetrator. And that was my understanding of it anyway. Now, although I didn't agree with it, was it an immoral thing to do? The situation here is quite different, however, because there was a period when Gabby was missing, where nobody knew what had happened to her besides Brian. And now Brian's back home, is in her vehicle, and Brian wants his parents' help to defend him in a legal sense. And so, according to the article, the Petitos claim that the Laundrie family gave them false hope that Gabby would be found alive in an attempt to protect their son Brian. Now, if you think about what's going on, the fact that his parents would pay money for a legal defense suggests that they believed that there was some sort of legal issue, serious legal issue. In other words, they must have believed that something serious had happened to Gabby, right? And had Brian not told his parents that Gabby was not just missing but no longer alive, and if the Petitos are saying that the Laundrie family gave them false hope while understanding that Gabby was no longer alive, I think then they do have a case. And I think that's really the critical question here. Did the Laundries think or know or suspect that Gabby was dead when they were telling the Petitos almost to expect that maybe she wasn't? Now, I wouldn't be surprised if Brian gave his own parents false hope, or whether Brian's parents were contaminated by false hope themselves. Because, and we've got to be careful not to have cognitive bias here, because we know the whole story, including the Moab stop, including the selfie Gabby took just prior to that, including the incident at the Merry Piglets. It's natural to assume the Laundries knew about this as well, but that's not actually how it works in real time. You don't know everything at the moment things are playing out in real time. And thus, did they have the knowledge and insight that Brian was probably guilty? Should they have had the knowledge and insight that Brian was probably guilty? And that's why we've got to be careful projecting backwards with all this knowledge. We've got to be aware of what they knew and what they probably knew. I do think it's a valid argument to say, why on earth would you get such a high-powered lawyer and pay for it if you didn't assume something serious had happened to Gabby? And if you had assumed that, why would you be telling the law? Why would the Laundries be telling the Petitos that hopefully she'll be found alive? And I suppose you could have a middle ground to that, where Brian might say, I don't know where she is, but maybe we've got to assume the worst, kind of thing. Now, let's also remember that the Laundries likely thought or hoped that their own son was still alive when they went to look for him and discovered his skeletal remains. I mean, that is how human psychology works. You may suspect that someone's not alive, or think in some part of your mind that someone's not alive, but nevertheless your emotions overpower that, and you hope and you try to believe that they're okay. We saw that with Caitlin Cash. I played that in a recent video. Is this the most impactful victim statement impact we've ever seen? And there you literally have someone who's been shot, lying in someone's home, no longer alive, and someone simply not believing that they've died, despite what almost seems obvious to many of us. And what's interfering with that cognitive aspect? Well, the person's relationship with that person, the person's connection to that person, to some extent emotions, perhaps an adrenaline, and love. Because you love somebody, you struggle to accept the worst, right, in terms of that. Now, although I'm not a fan of how the Laundries conducted themselves, I'm not sure whether there is something clearly criminal in their behavior or not. I'm just simply saying I'm not certain about it. Sometimes it seems like there is, and sometimes it seems like there isn't. There might be, there might not be. And one of the reasons I'm cautious about my support for the Petitos in their pursuit of the Laundries is because they have also pursued the Moab police. And this is just my personal position. I don't think the Moab cops did a great job at the Moab stop, but I also don't think they did a terrible job. And further, I don't think there was malice involved in what they were doing, the police. In other words, the mens rea, in terms of the police side of things from law enforcement, is lacking if you're going to try and make a case against them. And what's more, actus rea as well. In fact, they do actually separate the two and to some extent de-escalate the issue. Now, what I think is more constructive is that the Gabby Petito Act, which is being voted on currently, and may actually strengthen the response from law enforcement, at least in Florida, to these sorts of cases. If it becomes law, it will involve increased training for law enforcement. In other words, it will improve the police's ability to recognize patterns of guilty knowledge and guilty actions. During the Moab stop, arguably, there was a bit of both. Injuries to Gabby's face and arm, emotional overwhelm, defending the perpetrator and the perpetrator who had been driving recklessly and actually seen striking the victim, laughing it all off. Now, I actually wanted to put this analysis up a day or two ago, but I wanted to link it to this post on X, which took hours and hours to find. I knew I had it. It was just difficult to find. It was posted on X at the time. It was called Twitter more than 2 years ago. It's from the mother of Lauren McCluskey, a 21-year-old University of Utah student who was shot to death in the parking lot of her campus dorm by her boyfriend. Now, if you don't know about the story, I put links in the description. I do want to encourage you to read about Lauren's story. It really is pretty horrifying. I think it's there's a documentary on ESPN called Listen. You can also watch that if you haven't already. It may also be available on Disney+. Now, like Gabby, the police were aware of trouble between Lauren and her boyfriend. Unlike Gabby, Lauren wasn't emotional. You have a situation, and this is the tweet that Jill McCluskey put up. In fact, when I said I agree that we must do better, Jill actually liked that on Twitter. But the issue is that Gabby was apparently too emotional for the police to take her seriously, while Lauren was apparently too stoic. And that's what her mother says. Was Lauren supposed to be more emotional, given what was happening to her? And what was happening to her was serious. Lauren called the cops 6 times in the 10 days leading up to her murder. She was actually on the phone to her mother when she was attacked and dragged out of her dorm, and her mother actually heard her screaming, "No, no, no." Just like Gabby, Lauren's boyfriend later committed suicide as well. And so if the police had a better grasp of mens rea, the psychological aspect, and the situation that was escalating to a point of inevitability, if they could recognize these patterns and that things were approaching a point of no return, well, 2 lives could have been saved. And then there's also the wreckage surrounding those lives, the families of these people, the friends and people close to them. Now, in my opinion, there had to have been a point where the Laundries had to have strongly suspected their son's guilt. And the question then becomes, well, were they duty bound to cooperate? Were they legally bound to cooperate? It may seem like an obvious question with an obvious answer, but in the Caitlin Armstrong case, which sadly most of my subscribers don't seem to give a fuck about, it seems possible or even probable that Caitlin's sister helped her sister get out of the country after murdering Mo. There's so much we can learn about this case, and people just don't seem to care about it. Caitlin, in this case, used her sister's passport, traveled on the passport, and then had a nose job to try to look more like her. And there's been absolutely no charges against Christine Armstrong. So what I'm trying to say is Christine Armstrong seemed to have a much stronger, there seems to be a lot more activity helping her sister than in terms of the Laundries. And yet there were no charges against Christine. Now, maybe that's the prerogative of Mo Wilson's family. I don't know. In the Patrick Frazee case, there was a real accessory who literally cleaned up the crime scene. And she went to prison as an accessory for about 2 years. But of course, she cut a deal with the district attorney, a deal he described as a deal with the devil. In the Chris Watts case, people wanted there to be an accessory, and many people still believe there is one. I don't. But I think sometimes we mustn't take our eyes off the ball. Just because we want revenge or we want some kind of closure doesn't mean that everyone is fair game. And I think sometimes, like Brian Laundrie killed Gabby, no one else. Chris Watts killed his family, no one else. I think when we begin to blame others, also Caitlin Armstrong killed Mo Wilson, no one else. I think when we begin to blame others, including institutions, we've got to ask ourselves, was the perpetrator brought to justice? How did that happen? If it could have been prevented, and if law enforcement or even parents can do better, well, they should. But I think the path to a more just society begins by bringing perpetrators to justice, but then also not by looking at others who might be to blame, but by blaming ourselves. If we hold ourselves responsible and try to do better ourselves, law enforcement, but parents, family members as well, then I think then you can have a better society and a safer society and a society that cares about itself in an authentic way. Now, this might be controversial to say, but I think it remains extremely unfortunate that Gabby, during that night that she spent alone following the Moab stop, I think it's so sad that she didn't reach out to her parents and tell them what happened. I mean, they only knew about this when they saw it. They saw the body cam themselves. That's how they found out about it. Or when she was alone in a hotel for several days in Salt Lake City, she communicated with her father, asked him to send her a meal, but she didn't share her fears with her parents. She didn't share what was really going on with them. But the other side of that is that was an adult choice Gabby made at a time when she was wanting to be and trying to be an adult. In a sense, it was the right choice. If you were wanting to be an adult, you've got to take some responsibility for your own life. And that's just what she was trying to do. She didn't want to be coddled. She didn't want to be parented. She wanted to be independent. Brian also made choices, for example, to return to Gabby and then to do what he did and then to take his own life. I do think if the Laundries, especially Brian's mother, are guilty of anything, it's for coddling their son and not owning up to it. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.